Hello everybody, it is time on the Rosie Murphy channel again to take a little sojourn through history as we go through a additional month here, April, of lockdown due to the coronavirus. Very good precaution, I might add. Try to flatten the curve. We can certainly take some time to do some explorations of history, particularly as it relates to politics, pandemics, and the presidency. And that's what I want to talk about today. I love to dig into the little recesses of dark history that generally don't get the light of day when we study history in high school, or even historians, people that major in history in college. They're subjected to a broad range of world history. And I've always found the particular study of United States history fascinating and constantly being revised. We've had many authors that have published the real truth about things. And back in my time in the 50s, growing up in the 60s and getting my elementary education, textbooks were kind of polished up, promoting the company line, and you didn't really get a lot of true history until authors like, well, some people will say he shaded it the other way, authors like Howard Zinn, with the People's History of the United States of America, kind of fleshed in the reality of what went on, and history evolved over time to be a bit more balanced in its approach. And it's made it fascinating to observe, to watch this change over time. And as more information comes to light and researchers dig out more things that we can discover, it makes it very fascinating. Nothing's more fascinating at the current time than the study of pandemics, politics, and the presidency. It's interesting when we go back to 1918, there's a lot of people trying to connect the dots between 1918, the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, and what is happening today with the COVID-19 outbreak. So I'm sure there'll be plenty of books written, and it'll be a topic of movies and novels and things to come. Plenty of meat to chew on the bones there. But first and foremost, how did it get the name Spanish flu? And we're gonna talk about something here, and then relate that to today's experience. During 1918, well, let's go back to April of 1917, when Woodrow Wilson tried to maintain neutrality as best he could, even though we were supplying arms and foodstuffs to the Allies in World War I, mainly France and Germany. We were pretty determined to stay out of war, and that was Woodrow Wilson's slogan during re-election, was he kept us out of war. Well, he was pushed to the limit by the time April of 1917 came about. He went to Congress and declared war, I believe it was April 6th of 1917, on Germany. Due to Germany's policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, they said no longer would they try to surface and suss out what might be a passenger ship, what might be a hospital ship. They're all fair game from then on. And of course, the infamous Zimmerman telegram, which Germany proposed to Mexico that they invade the United States, and in return, once victory was assured against the United States, then Mexico could have back California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas. Well, obviously Mexico didn't bite, and they turned that information over to the United States State Department. Well, the United States had it up to there, and off to war we went, sending troops overseas. But in the middle of 1918, May of 1918, when things were really gearing up at that time, the president proposed the Sedition Act of 1918. Now, I'm going to tie this all together. Bear with me now. The Sedition Act of 19 prohibited people, the press, other organizations from speaking out and impeding the war effort. Therefore, newspapers were potentially liable for stories they put out, particularly if it was deemed that they were hurting morale, hurting the production of the war effort, and generally doing things to impede the United States in its pursuit of victory in World War I. And let me tell you, Wilson wanted victory bad. He wanted to smash the enemy so severely that they would not be able to form despot regimes and de facto dictatorships. He wanted to win in a real bad way. Having been dragged into the war, he determined he was going to do his level best to win it. So he did not need to worry about fighting forces at home that would rise and oppose socialists, communists that would rear up and start to breed and sow the seeds of dissension in the ranks of workers and potentially causing strikes and other things. So this Sedition Act clamped down the press in 1918 for the balance of the war and into 1919. Now, how does this relate to how it came to be known as the Spanish flu? Well, interestingly enough, Spain was neutral in World War I. Okay, they did not choose to be on either side and chose to be out of the war as much as possible. So their press was not restricted in what that they could print, and as influenza started to, the H1N1 influenza started to take hold in Spain, the number of cases soared, and the press got a hold of it. They were under no such restraint, and because people in the rest of the world that weren't involved in under orders that like France and Germany and the United States had to restrict the press, they printed freely about the epidemic that was exploding within the country of Spain. Hence, people associated the influenza of 1918 with the Spanish and believed that it originated there first. Of course, now we come to see that it has very long roots, and there's still some debate about where it originated. But I've kind of cast my lot in with Haskell, Kansas, is the point of origination. But this is why the epidemic, politics and the press labeled it the Spanish flu of 1918. Now, once having committed to the war, when the United States sent over their first wave of soldiers, in France, stepping off of the ships, they were receiving soldiers that were sick. Infections were spreading quickly, and the leader of the American Expeditionary Force, Blackjack Pershing, was his name, was so alarmed by the hospitals that were full of sick American soldiers, at one point reached 200,000, and sometimes 60% of entire regiments were killed by this influenza. He cabled Wilson that we don't have an effective fighting force that's hitting the ground here. These death ships like the Leviathan, where 100+ people are dying on a journey and hundreds are infected. We're getting troops over here that are useless. We're having to erect hospitals and care for these people. We can't put these people into battle. It is urgent that you send over more troops. Well, Wilson answered the call. Even though the local Surgeon General in Washington told him, we've got so many sick guys coming out of these camps in the United States, if we load these people on the ships, it's going to be death ships. Wilson's like, it's either that or we don't win the war. France and England go down, and that's all she wrote. So on to the ships they went. Well, they ended up losing a tremendous amount of people in the Spanish influenza pandemic of 1918, and it carried over to 1919, and something on the order of 50 million people died, and approximately 700,000 Americans. And let me tell you, those troop ships were really instrumental in helping to spread the influenza throughout Europe and the rest of the world. It's point of fact, it really is an American influenza that wreaked havoc on the world and was the most deadly thing in world history to come on the scene. Now, interestingly enough, once the war wound down, at the same time in late 1918, the influenza mutated to a less vicious form. It was still around through 1920. But in early 1919, Wilson wanted to journey to Paris to consult with the English and the French and the other allies about putting together some formal document to end World War I, and they needed Germany there. And Germany came because they believed that Wilson would help them achieve what they saw as a just peace. They knew if they were at the mercy of the French and the English, they would go really hard on them because of the vindictive spirit and the tremendous loss of life and money that had occurred in France and in England as they fought the war from 1914 through its conclusion in 1918. Well, Wilson arrived in Paris and began the negotiations, but then suddenly in early April of 1919, he took, 1919, in early April of 1919, he took violently ill. And the press, once again, to not arouse suspicion, never really got the story. They got a story that Wilson had a bad cold and was just laid up for a little bit. But there was total panic on the part of the White House surgeon, a person named Dr. Grayson, who remarked that he really thought that Wilson would be dead in a matter of a day or so because his fever spiked up to just short of 104 degrees. He had coughing fits so severe that they thought he was going to have a brain hemorrhage. He began to hallucinate heavily. He believed that furniture was being moved around in his parlor where he was attempting to recover. He believed that he was being watched by spies in every corner of the room. And more disturbingly, he started to be concerned about simple things like, what about who's using the official vehicles and who's allowed to drive the official vehicles? He started getting concerned about very petty things like, let's count the silverware that we brought with us and things, and real strange things that made people scratch their heads. Well, when he recovered, the recovery was terrible. And when the public first got the view of him again, including a young including a young Franklin D. Roosevelt and a young Winston Churchill, they were appalled by what they saw, the appearance of President Wilson. He, by all accounts, before that, being a president of Princeton University and then being governor of New Jersey, and arguably probably one of the most intelligent presidents with the highest IQ in the history of the United States. And in some ways he was reduced to babbling sometimes incoherently and being befuddled. And as he returned his attention to the conference, the things that he had fought bitterly to try to make sure that Germany had a just peace, he suddenly gave up on. He fought the French and the English tooth and nail to make sure Germany wouldn't be laid flat on his back, paying huge reparations for the war. Well, after his illness, it seemed like it didn't matter anymore. Okay, sounds good. You know, he did a 180-degree turnabout on a lot of different matters. And he went on to really resume his presidency in a very weakened state. And when he got back home to try to forward the League of Nations to America after the United States Senate under Henry Cabot Lodge had some reservations about the League of Nations. And remember, the Senate has to approve all treaties and things of that nature. And they didn't want to go along with it. A lot of the Republicans, they wanted to be isolated, not be involved in world politics. Well, of course, Wilson embarked on that ill-fated train trip across country, giving speeches day after day, and in exhaustion, he finally had a terrible stroke in the fall of 1919, and he almost died. The effect after that was his wife basically took over the presidency and his attending physician. Between the two of them, they ran the United States of America until the end of his presidency. He was never the same again. after that Spanish influenza. Interestingly enough, another future president of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt, was nominated to be the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he was, by all accounts, very, very good in this role. His name was well known because of his relationship to Theodore Roosevelt, and he served very ably in that capacity. Well, when it came time for him to come home, he had the misfortune of having to come back on the ship, the Leviathan, which was the death ship. It had taken so many United States soldiers to their graves throughout the First World War, just being transported to the battlefront. He contracted the influenza, and he was in such a weakened state when he got back to the United States that he couldn't even walk. He had to be carried out on a stretcher off of the ship, and then had to recover at his home in Hyde Park. As we can see, the Spanish influenza, it had a big impact in the highest offices of the land. But interestingly enough, here's the point I want to make. Not once in his presidency did President Wilson ever make mention of the Spanish influenza that was wreaking havoc across the nation. Remember, 11,000 people died in 1 month in Philadelphia in 1918, and not hardly a word in the press, because, well, the press was scared to say too much because of the Sedition Act. They did not want people to think, oh, I better not go to the factory today and impede the war effort. And yeah, they were really under close scrutiny by the Attorney General's office of the United States. So mum was the word. And it was amazing that in the midst of a pandemic, and in the end of it, it took the lives of almost 750,000 Americans. Our President of the United States didn't mention one thing about that in public. Well, it was a different time back then. We had a war on, so it never really had the profound effect that the COVID-19 has had here in 2020. That's for sure. We have a much more free press, and our press that tends to get out there and sometimes want to sensationalize and make things big and bad for ratings and other things. What a different world we live in today. Anyway, thanks so much for listening today. I hope you enjoyed this little sojourn into politics, pandemic, and the presidency. Have a wonderful day. Your thumbs up are appreciated. I hope you enjoyed this, and please leave your comments in the comments section below. Thank you.